My name's Jack Mercer. For most of my life, I thought peace was something you could build with your hands. I believed that if you worked hard enough, respected the land, and treated people fair, the world would treat you the same. I was wrong. For 32 years, I owned a 15,000-acre stretch of land just outside of Redwood County, Texas, my family ranch. It wasn't just dirt and fences. It was legacy. My grandfather carved that land out of wilderness during the Dust Bowl era. My father bled into the soil trying to keep it alive during the droughts of the 80s. And me? I turned it into something more than just a ranch. I made it a sanctuary. Every morning, I woke up before dawn. I'd brew coffee so strong it could peel paint, step onto the porch and watch the horizon light up gold. Herds of cattle grazed lazily across the east fields. The windmill creaked like an old friend, and the scent of cedar drifted through the air. My ranch hands, 6 of the most loyal men I'd ever met, were already saddling up before the sun even broke. That's what life was: rhythm, loyalty, and quiet pride. I didn't live near the city, folks. My nearest neighbor was 6 miles down a dirt road, and that's exactly how I liked it. Until one day, the city started crawling closer. They built a homeowners association community half a mile from my southern fence line, a place called Cedar Heights. Fancy houses, manicured lawns, HOA rules about paint colors and mailbox sizes. At first I thought nothing of it. Let the city folks live how they want, as long as they stayed off my land. But people like that, they don't see land. They see opportunity. It started small. One morning I found surveyor stakes hammered into my fence line, bright orange flags waving like insults in the wind. I called the county office. They told me some boundary readjustments were being reviewed. I laughed it off. I had my deed, my title, and every boundary stone my grandfather had placed by hand. But a few weeks later I received a letter, thick, stamped with the HOA's logo. "Dear Mr. Mercer," it read, "the Cedar Heights Association has voted to annex the southern portion of your land for community development in accordance with county zoning guidelines." Annex. They used that word like it meant nothing. I called their office immediately. Some woman named Karen Wallace, head of the HOA board, answered. She spoke in that smug, fake-friendly tone city bureaucrats use when they think they're talking to someone beneath them. "Mr. Mercer, this is just a formal procedure. The new development zone overlaps slightly with your property, but compensation will be provided accordingly." I asked her how much land she meant. "Only about 80 acres, she said. 80 acres. To her, that was slight. I told her I wasn't selling a damn inch. She chuckled, and said, "Oh, Mr. Mercer, you don't really have a choice. The papers are already in motion." That was the day I realized peace doesn't mean safety. 2 months later, my southern pasture was bulldozed. The fence ripped apart, soil churned under machines I didn't authorize. I called the sheriff, but by the time they showed up, the contractors had permits. I showed my title deeds, but the county office said they'd been updated, somehow, through forged documents, backroom deals, and the HOA's money. I had just sold my land without ever signing a thing. I hired a lawyer, small-town guy named Elliot Briggs. He looked over the paperwork, scratching his head in disbelief. "Jack," he said, "this isn't just a clerical error. This looks intentional. Someone rewrote your parcel numbers." He was right. The HOA's legal team had filed fake subdivision plans, claimed my ranch was abandoned commercial land, and auctioned it off to a development trust they secretly owned. My family ranch, the one my grandfather built, was sold on paper while I still stood on it. I spent the next weeks fighting every way I could. Meetings, hearings, courtrooms, all filled with smug HOA attorneys who treated me like dirt. They smiled as they talked about progress and urban expansion. They weren't just stealing land. They were erasing a legacy. Then came the final blow, a court order demanding I vacate private property belonging to Cedar Heights Development. I remember standing at my gate as the sheriff's car pulled up. Sheriff Nolan, an old friend, looked down, couldn't even meet my eyes. "Jack, I'm sorry. I've got an order. I didn't fight him." I just nodded. I walked back inside, packed a single duffel bag, took one last look at the ranch house my father built, and left. The wind was howling that day, dry and angry. For 3 years, I lived out of a truck. Slept in motels, worked odd jobs. Everyone told me to move on, but they didn't understand that ranch wasn't just dirt. It was home. It was my blood one night. I was drinking coffee in a small diner off I-45 when a familiar name came on the TV, Cedar Heights HOA. They were under investigation for financial misconduct. Turns out, their treasurer had been caught embezzling funds. But that wasn't the part that made me sit up straight. In the report, they mentioned a real estate trust the HOA used to acquire rural land for future development. I knew that trust. It was the same one that bought my ranch. And here's the kicker. The trust was listed under public holding, meaning any shareholder could legally challenge ownership of its assets. That was the first crack in their armor. So I started digging. Nights, weekends, I haunted public record databases, county archives, and legal filings. I learned every trick they used against me, and every loophole they'd left open. It took me a year, but I found it, a clause buried in their corporate registration. It stated that if the HOA's development trust ever failed to pay property taxes for consecutive years, all assets could be legally claimed by the highest public bidder during auction. And guess what? They hadn't paid in 3 years. That's when I smiled for the first time in a long while. Because justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears patience. I sold everything I owned, cashed in my life insurance, borrowed from friends who still believed in me. Then I waited. The day of the auction, I walked into that courthouse wearing the same boots I'd been kicked off my land in. There were maybe a dozen people there, most of them investors. The auctioneer started rattling off numbers, the HOA's assets, their development parcels, their unsold homes, their unspecified rural properties. One by one, I bid. Calm, steady, and deliberate. Every time Karen Wallace's lawyer tried to raise the price, I raised it higher. Until finally, with one last gavel strike, the auctioneer shouted, "Sold! To Mr. Jack Mercer!" That was the moment I took everything back, and more. But this isn't the end. This is just the start, because what I bought that day wasn't just my ranch. I bought their homes, their streets, their clubhouse, their world, and I wasn't done yet. When you lose everything, time changes. It stops rushing, it crawls. Every day feels like a slow replay of what they took from you. For 3 years, I lived with that hollow ache in my chest, the silence of a land that used to breathe with me. But the day I walked out of that courthouse with those property titles in hand, the silence broke. I drove straight back to Redwood County. The roads were different now, paved, polished, decorated with pointless street lamps and trimmed hedges. They'd even renamed the main road. Used to be Mercer Trail, now it was Cedar Heights Boulevard. The arrogance of it made me laugh out loud as I pulled my truck over and looked at the new sign. I tore it out of the ground. I didn't do it out of anger. It was ceremony. I threw it into the back of my truck and drove on. When I reached what used to be my southern pasture, I couldn't recognize it. Rows of luxury homes stood where my cattle used to graze. Identical lawns, white fences, mailboxes, all painted the same dull beige. And at the very end of that street, just past where my barn once stood, sat a 2-story mansion with glass railings and a black SUV parked out front. Karen Wallace's house. I parked my truck across the street. Stepped out. The air smelled like fertilizer and fake flowers. Kids' bicycles lay scattered on driveways. Sprinklers hissed softly in rhythm. For a moment, I felt like a ghost, invisible, walking through the ruins of my past. Then Karen stepped out of her house. Same perfect hair, same expensive smile. She didn't recognize me at first. Not in the old leather jacket, not with the stubble and the sunburn. But when our eyes met, I saw the flicker. Recognition, then disbelief. "Jack?" she said, voice tight. "What are you—" I pulled a folded piece of paper from my jacket. "You might want to read this." She hesitated, then took it. Her eyes scanned the page, her face draining color as she read the header. Notice of property transfer. Cedar Heights Development Holdings. "This is a joke," she whispered. "No, Karen," I said softly. "It's justice. I didn't stay to argue." I just tipped my hat and walked away while she stood there trembling, still clutching the paper. That was the first notice. The rest went out the same day. Every HOA board member, every homeowner in Cedar Heights, all received certified letters informing them that the ownership of their lots had legally transferred under the auction purchase. By law, they had 90 days to vacate or renegotiate occupancy under new ownership. My ownership. 3 days later, my phone exploded. Lawyers, reporters, HOA representatives, all demanding explanations, trying to find loopholes. But I'd done my homework. Every step was airtight. The same legal machinery they used to rob me, I had used to reclaim it. And this time they couldn't hide behind bureaucracy. Because now I was the bureaucracy. Still, revenge wasn't enough. I wanted truth. I wanted the world to know what they'd done. So I went digging deeper. Through public records, I discovered how they'd built their empire. False environmental studies, fake land appraisals, kickbacks from construction companies. They'd turned corruption into a business model. And the deeper I dug, the more rot I found. Elliot, my old lawyer, came back into the picture when I called him. "Jack, you're playing with fire," he said. "If you push too hard, they'll bury you again." "Not this time," I told him. "This time, I own the shovel." I started releasing documents anonymously, leaks to local news, online forums, investigative journalists. Each drop was calculated. Emails between board members discussing forged permits, proof of falsified tax records, photos of undeclared construction dumping sites. Within weeks, the story caught fire. Cedar Heights HOA under criminal investigation. Developers linked to fraudulent land seizures. Whistleblower exposes county-level corruption. They didn't know the whistleblower was me. Not yet. Meanwhile, I drove out to the ranch, the untouched northern acres, the land they hadn't gotten to before their downfall. I stood there as the sunset rolled across the grass, the wind whispering through mesquite trees. The land still remembered me. I rebuilt the front gate first. Same wood, same iron hinges. Over the arch, I carved one word: resurgence. That night, under the stars, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't just take back what was mine. I'd make sure no one ever did this to another man again. 2 weeks later, Karen showed up at my ranch gate. She was alone this time. No lawyers, no arrogance. Just desperation. "Jack, please," she said through the bars. "This isn't fair. You can't just take people's homes." I stared at her for a long moment. "Funny," I said. "That's exactly what you told me 3 years ago." Her voice cracked. "There are families, children. There were families on this land long before you paved it over." She looked down, ashamed. Then she did something I didn't expect. She started crying. Real tears, not the kind you shed for show. "I didn't know," she said. "I didn't know how deep it went. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to throw her off my land." But there was something in her voice. Guilt, exhaustion, maybe even truth. "You want to make it right?" I asked. She nodded. "Then tell me everything. Names, documents, deals, and all of it." And she did. For the next 3 hours, we sat at my old kitchen table while she unfolded the entire web. The bribes, the forged signatures, the county clerk who'd been paid off. I recorded every word. By the time she left, I had enough evidence to bring down the entire network. The next morning, I walked into the county courthouse. Same one where they'd once kicked me out. The clerk looked up and froze. "Mr. Mercer?" "Not Mr. anymore," I said, handing over a thick file. "Plaintiff." That file triggered a lawsuit so massive it made the front page of the Dallas Tribune. Mercer versus Cedar Heights Association and County Development Office. For weeks they tried to bury it, stall it, twist it. But every time they moved, I had another piece of proof ready. Every bribe, every forgery, every illegal transaction. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Elliot, staring down the same people who'd once laughed me out of hearings. Karen testified on my behalf. The county clerk was arrested mid-trial. By the time it ended, the judge's voice carried through the silence. Judgment in favor of the plaintiff, Jack Mercer. The courtroom erupted. Cameras flashed. I just sat there, quiet, as the words sank in. 3 years of humiliation, loss, and anger, washed away in one verdict. But the justice system didn't stop there. The judge ordered full restitution. Every stolen acre, every fraudulent dollar. And since I already owned the development properties through the auction, the court declared them forfeit to the plaintiff pending community reassignment. In simple words, I legally owned Cedar Heights, every street, every home, every inch of the land they built over my legacy. The first thing I did was tear down the HOA gate sign, the same one that once told me I didn't belong. I replaced it with a simple wooden board that read, Mercer Ranch, open grounds. Then I opened the land. Not for developers, not for profit, for people. For veterans, farmers, families who'd lost their homes to the same kind of greed I'd faced. They came from all over Texas, rebuilding lives where mine had been destroyed. Some called it revenge. I called it restoration. And yet, deep down I knew the war wasn't over. Because the people I'd beaten, they weren't small. They had money, connections, shadows stretching further than one county, and soon enough, those shadows would reach back for me. But that was fine. Because this time, I wasn't alone. This time, I had the law, the truth, and 15,000 acres of justice at my back. It didn't take long for the wolves to regroup. 2 weeks after the verdict, I woke up to the sound of tires crunching on gravel. When I stepped out onto the porch, a convoy of black SUVs was waiting at the gate. Men in suits, sunglasses, the kind of people who don't introduce themselves. They just expect you to know who they represent. The leader, tall and clean-cut, stepped forward. "Mr. Mercer," he said calmly, "we're here on behalf of Redwood Development Holdings." I didn't invite him in. I just leaned against the post and crossed my arms. "You folks bought a lot of land with dirty money," I said. "What do you want now?" He smiled like a man used to owning the room. "We'd like to make you an offer. Substantial compensation, in exchange for the Cedar Heights property portfolio." "You've made your point. Let's not drag this out." I almost laughed. They thought this was still about money. "You think you can just buy back what you stole?" I said quietly. He didn't flinch. "You'll find the offer generous. We can wire funds immediately." 7 figures, I shook my head. "There's not enough zeros in your bank to buy back honor." For a second, his professional mask cracked. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Mercer." "No," I said, turning back toward the house. "You made it 3 years ago." "I'm just fixing it." As I walked away, I heard him mutter into his phone. "He's not selling." That was the beginning of the next battle. Over the following weeks, things got strange. My fences were cut, cameras smashed, trucks vandalized. One night, a fire broke out near the eastern barn. Old hay bales went up like torches. Luckily, the volunteer fire department got there fast, but I knew it wasn't random. Someone wanted to scare me off the land. Elliot urged me to stay cautious. "They've lost millions because of you, Jack," he said over the phone. "Developers like that, they don't forgive." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," I said. "Just justice." Still, I wasn't naive. I started installing security cameras, floodlights, motion sensors. Hired 2 ranch hands to stay overnight. But no amount of lights could keep the darkness away forever. About a month later, I got a letter from the Texas Department of Environmental Affairs. They were reviewing alleged violations on the Mercer Ranch property, alleged contamination, illegal soil dumping, false accusations, every one of them, but enough to start an investigation that could freeze my assets. I knew who was behind it. Redwood Development Holdings, same people who used to own the HOA. They couldn't beat me in court, so now they were using the system against me. I drove to the city office to meet with the investigator assigned to my case. A young woman in a gray suit greeted me. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Agent Laurel White. I'm just here to assess the claims." I studied her eyes. Clear, steady, not corrupt. "And if I can prove they're lying?" "Then we shut them down," she said. I liked her already. Together we went through the property records, satellite images, and water test results. Every document the developers had submitted was doctored. They'd used old aerial photos from before the land was cleaned up, trying to make it look contaminated. Laurel filed her report. 2 weeks later, I got the call. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice smiling through the phone. "You're cleared. But Redwood Holdings isn't. We're opening a federal inquiry." That was the first real victory since the trial. Not just revenge, but accountability. Meanwhile, life returned to the ranch. The people I'd let live on the reclaimed land, the veterans, the families, started planting gardens, rebuilding barns, raising fences. The laughter of children echoed again through the valley. It wasn't just home anymore. It was community. One evening, as I was fixing a fence post, a boy from one of the new families ran up. "Mr. Mercer, there's a man waiting at the gate for you." I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked over. Standing there was an older man in a suit, silver hair, calm eyes. "Mr. Mercer," he said, extending a hand. "Name's Thomas Wexler. I used to work for Redwood Holdings." I didn't shake his hand. "Used to?" He nodded. "Until last week. They're trying to bury something big, something tied to Cedar Heights." "Go on," I said cautiously. "They funneled money from offshore accounts to buy the county's zoning board years before your ranch was seized. It wasn't just the HOA. It was a statewide operation. You were one of dozens." I felt my chest tighten. "How many others?" He hesitated. At least 42 properties across 3 counties, all acquired through manipulated records. Some owners never even knew. He handed me a flash drive. Everything's on here. Transactions, meeting notes, wire transfers. But if you use it, they'll come after you again. I took the drive. They already are. He nodded once quietly. Then good luck, Mr. Mercer. That night, I sat at my desk staring at that flash drive. I could take it to the press. I could hand it to Laurel. I could burn the whole empire down. But I also knew what that meant. Another war. Bigger, louder, and more dangerous. I plugged it in. The files opened like a confession. Names, banks, offshore shells, even county judges on the payroll. It was corruption so deep it made my stomach turn. One name stood out. Senator Ronald Keene. The man behind the state's Development Expansion Act. The same law that had allowed HOAs like Cedar Heights to expand into rural zones. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled slowly and muttered, "So that's who's been pulling the strings." This wasn't just about my ranch anymore. It was about everyone they'd bled dry. Elliot came by the next morning. "You look like hell," he said. I handed him the drive, because I found the devil's receipts. He plugged it into his laptop, and as he scrolled through the files, his eyes went wide. "Jack, this could take down half the state's development board. That's the plan." He hesitated. "You sure about this? Once this goes public, they'll destroy your life all over again." I smiled faintly. "They already did once. The difference now is, I've got nothing left to lose." We drafted the release carefully. Laurel would deliver the legal evidence to the Environmental Division, while Elliot would leak the political side to the Tribune under verified documentation. We timed everything to hit simultaneously, legal, financial, and media pressure converging in one day. We called it Operation Resurgence, the same word carved above my gate. The day it broke, it was chaos. Headlines everywhere. Senator linked to illegal land seizures. Redwood Holdings under federal probe. Whistleblower evidence traces back to HOA corruption scandal. By noon, the senator was holding an emergency press conference, denying everything. By midnight, the FBI had raided his office, and just like that, the empire began to crumble. I thought I'd feel satisfaction. But what I felt instead was something quieter. Release. The kind that comes when truth finally claws its way into daylight. Still, not everyone was happy. One night, as I drove home from town, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. Too close, too steady. I took a side road. They followed. I stopped the truck. The other vehicle stopped too. I stepped out, hand resting on the old revolver holstered at my side. 2 men got out. No words, just the gleam of metal under the moonlight. Before they could move, floodlights blazed from the trees. My ranch hands. I'd taught them to keep watch. The men froze, blinded. "Get off my land," I said coldly. They backed off, drove away without another word. That was their warning. Their last one. A month later, federal charges were filed against multiple executives of Redwood Holdings and county officials. Karen testified again, this time to the grand jury. The whole scandal unraveled. When it was over, Laurel visited my ranch one last time. "You did something rare, Mr. Mercer," she said. "You didn't just fight back. You changed how they play the game." I looked across the fields, golden in the evening light. "I didn't want to change the game," I said. "I just wanted to stop them from burning the board." She smiled. "Either way, people will remember." That night I sat by the porch, coffee steaming in the cool air. The stars stretched wide across the Texas sky. For the first time in years, I felt something like peace. Not because I'd won, but because I'd endured. But as I stared at the horizon, I knew peace never lasts forever. Because greed doesn't die, it just changes its name, and if it ever came back to my land again, it would find me waiting. I had spent months rebuilding my life in silence. No grand speeches, no dramatic gestures, just quiet, strategic moves. The kind that look insignificant from the outside until they begin to align like chess pieces on a board. The HOA thought they had buried me under the weight of their lawyers, forged deeds and bureaucratic smirks. But in reality, I had been learning, reading every line of property law, every loophole they had used against me. I studied the very systems they believed only they could manipulate, and slowly, piece by piece, I built a web around them. When I'd first lost the ranch, the pain had been unbearable. My father's handprints were still on the barn doors. the initials of my mother carved into the oak tree by the creek. Every inch of that 15,000-acre land was history, my history. Losing it had been like losing my bloodline. But pain can be an extraordinary teacher. I realized that if they could take something so massive from me through paperwork, deceit, and signatures, then maybe I could do the same to them. Not through vengeance that breaks laws, but vengeance that uses them. I didn't want to burn their world. I wanted to own it, so I started with silence. The first step was forming an LLC. Quiet, unremarkable, and under a name that would never connect back to me. Then another and another, each one legally distinct, each one with its own purpose. Some were investment fronts, others were property acquisition firms, and through them I began purchasing tiny parcels of land. Insignificant-looking lots across the HOA's development district, an empty drainage strip here, a narrow easement there. Little things the HOA board never bothered to inspect, but I did. You see, what they didn't realize was that in their rush to expand, to build swimming pools, clubhouses, and gated entrances, they had made one fatal mistake. They had merged several properties without consolidating the titles properly. That meant there were small, fragmented pieces of land, invisible on public maps, that legally existed between their streets, lots, and fences. I started buying those invisible spaces. By the time they noticed, I owned 37 microlots, scattered like a spider's web right through the heart of their neighborhood. Driveways, walkways, even pieces of their entrance road technically ran across my property now, and that gave me leverage, but I wasn't done. Through another LLC, I began buying delinquent tax liens. The HOA had a habit of taking over properties when homeowners defaulted, but they had no idea that I was quietly bidding on the liens before they could. Within a year, I held title to 15 houses they thought they still controlled through unpaid assessments. The day I walked into the county clerk's office to verify ownership, the clerk gave me a long, curious look. "Sir, you're listed as owner for these many addresses," I smiled. "Just doing a little community service." The turning point came when one of the HOA board members, a smug little man named Reynolds, tried to host an open meeting about expanding community boundaries. His tone was the same as always, patronizing, bureaucratic, fake polite. I showed up at the meeting, sitting quietly in the back. He didn't even recognize me at first. "Residents," he began, "as your HOA president, I assure you all future projects are aimed at increasing property value and community pride." When I stood, the murmurs began. A few old-timers recognized me, the man they'd watched lose his ranch a year ago. "Mr. Reynolds," I said, my voice steady, calm, rehearsed. "You're holding this meeting on a property that doesn't belong to you," he frowned. "Excuse me?" "The land beneath this clubhouse," I said, pulling out a document, "is part of parcel 1763B, owned by Prairie View Holdings, LLC. That's me." The room went silent. You could hear the air conditioning hum. Reynolds laughed nervously. "That's impossible." I slid the certified deed across the table. "It's legal. Filed with the county 3 months ago. I'd advise you to move this building before next quarter, or start paying rent." Laughter erupted from the audience. The mighty HOA, suddenly humbled by one of their former victims. That night, word spread faster than wildfire. Some called me crazy, others called me a genius, but all of them knew one thing: I was back. And this time, I wasn't fighting to get my ranch back. I was fighting to take back everything they stood for. Over the next few weeks, the HOA board scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. Lawyers were hired. Emergency meetings were called. Property maps were redrawn. But it was too late. Every piece of paper confirmed the same truth. They had built half their empire on land they didn't own, and I wasn't done twisting the knife. I started sending invoices. Official. Legal, impossible to ignore, for land use fees. Each parcel I owned came with a rental bill, backdated and itemized. I sent them through registered mail, stamped and signed by my attorney. They ignored the first one. They laughed at the second. By the third, they realized I wasn't bluffing. Within a month, their entire legal budget was being spent trying to contest ownership claims they couldn't win. Because every document, every map, every record came straight from the county office. Everything was airtight. I had spent a year making sure of it. One morning I got a call from a woman named Evelyn Marks, a lawyer representing several homeowners under that HOA. She spoke with careful authority. "Mr. Carter, My clients are concerned about the sudden property disputes. They say you're claiming ownership over their land. I chuckled softly. Not their land, Ms. Marks. The HOA's. I'm just collecting rent where rent is due. There was a pause. Then she asked the question I'd been waiting for. What exactly do you want? That was the moment I realized how much the tables had turned. Once upon a time, I had begged to keep what was mine. Now they were calling me to negotiate. I want justice, I said quietly. And for once, I want the law to serve the man it crushed. The legal storm that followed made headlines in 3 counties. Local HOA faces massive property ownership scandal. Rancher turns legal tables on former HOA. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know how a man who'd lost everything had orchestrated one of the most calculated legal reversals in local history. But I stayed quiet. No interviews, no comments, because this wasn't about fame. It was about legacy. I remember driving past the old ranch one evening, watching the sun bleed over the horizon. It looked smaller now, not because of its size, but because I had outgrown it. The man who once lived there had been naive, trusting, sentimental. But the man looking at it now had become something else, sharper, colder, more deliberate, still human, but unbreakable. That night, I got an unexpected visit. A truck pulled up outside my office. The door creaked open, and out stepped Tom Jennings, one of the only board members who'd shown me any kindness before everything went south. He looked older, tired. You're tearing them apart, he said. You've already humiliated them, Carter. Isn't that enough? Enough? I leaned back, watching him carefully. Was it enough when they took everything from me? He sighed, glancing around the dimly lit office. I tried to warn them. I told Reynolds it was wrong what they did to you. But you're starting to become just like them. That hit harder than I expected. I didn't answer immediately. He wasn't wrong. Revenge has a way of poisoning even the purest cause. But this wasn't just revenge anymore. It was balance. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark landscape. You know what I realized, Tom? Justice isn't about fairness. It's about power. The ones who have it make the rules. The rest of us get crushed by them. I'm just making sure the scales tip back. For everyone they've crushed. He shook his head. Just don't lose yourself in the process. Then he left. His words lingered long after his taillights vanished. By winter, the HOA's structure had collapsed. Their president, Reynolds, had resigned after their insurance company withdrew coverage for legal claims. The neighborhood was fractured, homeowners divided, board members fighting one another, and while they were distracted, I made my final move. I filed a motion to foreclose on several properties the HOA had used as collateral for their loans, properties that, thanks to my quiet acquisitions, now legally fell under my ownership boundaries. It was the same legal mechanism they had once used against me. The irony was poetic. When the court ruled in my favor, the decision was short but devastating. In accordance with property boundaries and ownership documentation provided by Prairie View Holdings, LLC, the court recognizes said entity as the lawful proprietor of the disputed lots and attached structures. In plain English, I now legally owned several of their homes. I walked through one of them a week later. A modern 2-story with a perfect lawn, white shutters, and a flag on the porch. The silence was heavy. The people who had mocked me in HOA meetings now lived under my authority. It wasn't joy I felt. It wasn't even triumph, it was peace. Cold, calculated, earned peace. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. The same signatures that once stripped me of my ranch were now transferring their homes into my possession. Reynolds tried one last desperate move, a lawsuit claiming malicious intent. He accused me of using shell companies and predatory acquisition practices. I read the complaint over a cup of black coffee. Amused by its familiarity, they had called me greedy, manipulative, dangerous. But the truth was simpler. I had played their game better than they ever could. When we met in court, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters filled the benches. Neighbors whispered as the same man they once voted against walked in wearing a calm, dark suit. I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to finish what they started. Reynolds' lawyer stood, voice trembling slightly. Your Honor, the defendant, Mr. Carter, deliberately engineered this chaos to dismantle the HOA and personally profit from its downfall. My attorney, A quiet, sharp woman named Helen Carter, no relation, rose without even glancing at him. "Your Honor," she said coolly, "my client simply operated within the confines of the law. The very law this HOA used to wrongfully seize his property. If they had followed due process, none of this would have happened." She paused, then looked directly at Reynolds. "But justice has a long memory, doesn't it?" The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Reynolds, did your organization at any point verify parcel ownership before expanding onto adjoining lands?" Reynolds hesitated. "It was implied." "Implied is not ownership," the judge interrupted. That single sentence sealed it. The courtroom erupted in whispers. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I just felt free. That evening, I drove back to the ranch, my ranch, for the first time since that dark day they'd taken it. The gates creaked as I pushed them open. The smell of dust and cedar hit me like a memory made real. I walked down to the creek, where the water shimmered under the last traces of sunset. The oak tree still stood, strong and silent. I ran my fingers along its bark until I found the faded initials, J+E, my parents. A wind moved through the fields, bending the tall grass like a bow. For a long while, I said nothing. Just listened. It wasn't about money anymore. Not land, not even justice. It was about legacy. About proving that truth might bend under power, but it never truly breaks. As I stood there, headlights appeared on the dirt road behind me. Helen stepped out of her car, files in hand. "It's done," she said softly. "They've settled. Full restitution. The HOA's dissolved." I nodded slowly. "How much?" "More than you lost," she said. "But that's not what matters, is it?" "No," I said. "It's not." A few months later, the neighborhood that once mocked me became a quiet, almost ghostly place. The signs that once read Whispering Pines HOA Managed Community were gone. The office that had handled complaints and fines now stood empty. People moved away. Some left notes on their doors, apologies, confessions, even thanks. One said simply, "You taught us what happens when power forgets its humanity." I kept that note, because that was the truth of it all. I hadn't destroyed them. They had destroyed themselves. I had only shown them the mirror. In the months that followed, I started something new. Using part of the settlement money, I built a legal aid foundation to help small farmers and property owners fight back against corporate overreach. We called it the Carter Initiative. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about ensuring no one else would have to stand alone like I once did. The first case we won was for an old rancher in the next county. They'd tried to seize his land over unpaid association fees. I drove out to see him after the ruling. He looked at me with teary eyes and said, "They said I didn't stand a chance." "How'd you do it?" I smiled. "I just learned how the game works." He laughed softly. "Then you must be one hell of a player." "No," I said. "Just someone who stopped being the pawn." The last time I stood on my porch, watching the wind roll over the endless fields of grass and gold, I realized something profound. They took everything from me. My home, my pride, my peace. But in losing all that, I gained clarity. Justice isn't something that comes from courts or verdicts. It's born from endurance, the refusal to stay broken. So when I finally closed my eyes and breathed in that familiar scent of soil and wind, I whispered something to the land itself, something my father once told me when I was a boy. "If they ever take what's yours, son, don't fight to steal it back. Fight to make sure they can never take it from anyone again." And in that moment, I knew he'd be proud. When I won the judgment against the HOA, most people thought that was the end of the story. They saw the headlines, the courtroom photos, and the triumphant sound bites on local TV and assumed I'd ridden off into the sunset, the underdog who got justice. But real justice doesn't end in a courtroom. It begins there, because behind every verdict there are still signatures, debts, and chains of command that reach deeper than any single board or HOA, and in my case, that chain led to something far bigger, the developer conglomerate that had created the HOA in the first place. Their name was Silver Ridge Holdings, a billion-dollar company with fingers in every zoning board and council in 3 states. And while the local HOA had fallen apart, Silver Ridge still owned the land titles, construction bonds, and future development rights tied to my old ranch. They weren't going to let a single man ruin their empire. 3 weeks after the verdict, I got the letter, thick, embossed and written in that polite legal tone that masks poison beneath politeness. Dear Mr. Carter, Silver Ridge Holdings expresses concern regarding recent litigation outcomes and their impact on future development projects. We believe an amicable resolution can be reached, provided mutual understanding is established. Sincerely, Corporate Affairs Department, Silver Ridge Holdings, amicable resolution. That was corporate code for, we're coming for you. I didn't panic. I didn't even flinch. I'd expected this move. I knew these people didn't care about right or wrong, only ownership. To them, property was power, and power was absolute. But I had learned from the best, from them. I called Helen, my attorney, and handed her the letter. She read it twice and exhaled slowly. They're not threatening you directly. They're laying the groundwork for a buyout, or a smear campaign. Both, I said. They want to bury me under headlines and lawsuits until I sell. She nodded. Then we fight differently this time. Quietly. That's when the counterstrike began. I started digging. Every deal Silver Ridge had made, every parcel they'd bought, every easement they'd manipulated, I traced them all. With Helen's help and a few discreet investigators, we followed the paper trail deep into their acquisitions. What we found was worse than I imagined. They had been running a systematic scheme, buying out struggling rural homeowners, pushing them into HOA contracts, and then foreclosing on them when fees piled up. My case wasn't an accident. It was part of their playbook, and now I had proof. Emails between board members and corporate reps. Land deeds notarized on weekends, illegal under state law. Dozens of transactions that violated zoning restrictions. But the crown jewel was one memo dated 7 years ago, titled Phase 3, Expansion, Prairie Ridge Land Conversion. That memo outlined a plan to relocate existing tenants from rural tracts to suburban developments, in plain English, to erase ranching families from the area. My family's land was listed as one of the first targets. That was my spark. I wasn't going to stop at Revenge anymore. I was going to dismantle the system that had enabled people like them to exist. The next step was to go public, but not through the news. Not yet. First, I needed leverage. So I approached a man named Daniel Frost, a mid-level project manager at Silver Ridge. He'd been with them for over a decade, ambitious, but disillusioned. We met in a small diner outside the city. He looked nervous, constantly glancing toward the door. I don't know if I should even be talking to you, he said. They watch everything. They watched me too, I said. And they stole everything I had. You want to make it right? Help me expose them. He hesitated, then slid a USB drive across the table. I copied internal audit files before they deleted them. They've been hiding losses in offshore subsidiaries. If the SEC finds out, I smiled. They won't just lose their developments. They'll lose their freedom. That was the moment I knew. This was bigger than one man and one ranch. This was a war between corruption and consequence. By the time Silver Ridge realized what was happening, I'd already built a coalition, former landowners, lawyers, and whistleblowers who had all been wronged in similar ways. Together we formed the Land Justice Committee, a nonprofit dedicated to investigating corporate land fraud. And we didn't just investigate, we prosecuted. Our first official complaint to the State Attorney General's office included over 200 pages of documented fraud. Within weeks, an official inquiry began. Silver Ridge called me personally after that. The voice on the other end was smooth, calm, rehearsed. Mr. Carter, this can all go away. We'll restore your ranch, buy out your holdings, and compensate you generously if you withdraw your filings. I didn't even think about it. You think this is about money? I said quietly. You took my family's legacy and turned it into profit margins. You erased people from maps. You don't get to buy silence anymore. The line went dead. And just like that, the Empire had declared war. The first strike from Silver Ridge came fast and ruthless. They filed a defamation lawsuit against me and the Land Justice Committee, claiming we'd fabricated documents and manipulated evidence to intentionally harm the company's reputation. It was a strategic move, not to win, but to drain us. They wanted to bury us under legal fees, force us into silence through exhaustion. But I had prepared for that too. Helen and I had set up an emergency legal fund through small donations from people we'd helped. Farmers, homeowners, small business owners, the kind of folks who'd once stood alone against giants. Within 48 hours of the lawsuit being announced, Our fund had doubled in size. For the first time, I realized I wasn't the only one fighting this war. We were an army. Silver Ridge's next move was dirtier. They started a media smear campaign. News stations began running hit pieces with headlines like, "Disgraced rancher targets local development firm in vicious vendetta. Activist or opportunist?" Inside, the man trying to take down Silver Ridge. They painted me as unstable, a bitter old landowner seeking revenge through lies. It would have worked too, if they hadn't underestimated one thing: the truth. We started releasing our own evidence, public documents, signed memos, recorded calls, and drone footage of illegal developments on protected land. Every week a new revelation hit social media like wildfire, and then came the one that broke everything open. Daniel, the Silver Ridge insider, had risked everything to pull internal surveillance footage from a private meeting. The video showed senior executives laughing as they discussed falsifying land valuations. One line in particular made national headlines: "They're just ranchers. They'll sign whatever's put in front of them." That single sentence became a rallying cry. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every ordinary person who'd ever been stepped on by corporate greed. Soon, the world started watching. The Department of Justice opened an official investigation. Several state senators called for hearings on corporate land fraud and rural displacement. Silver Ridge's stock price plummeted by 30% in a week, but power never surrenders. Quietly, late one night, I was driving back from a meeting when I noticed a black SUV in my rearview mirror. No plates, no headlights when I turned off the main road. I pulled over near the ridge overlooking the valley, the same ridge I'd stood on the night they took my ranch. The SUV slowed but didn't stop. Its tinted window rolled down just enough for me to see a cigarette spark. Then it drove off. Message received. They were trying to intimidate me. But intimidation only works on a man who has something left to lose. I had already lost everything once. The next morning, I filed for federal whistleblower protection, not for myself, but for Daniel and the other insiders who'd stepped forward. The law was on our side now. Meanwhile, Helen worked night and day to consolidate our cases. "We're not just defending anymore," she said. "We're going on offense." And we did. Our legal filings began to mirror their own tactics, using every clause, every precedent, every hidden rule buried in decades of legislation. I'd learned their language, and now I spoke it better than they did. We hit them with land use violations, environmental breaches, zoning fraud, and even RICO, charges for organized corporate conspiracy. Every time they filed an appeal, we filed 3 more motions. Every time they sent a threat, we sent proof. And slowly, their empire began to crack. Then came the courtroom showdown. The hearing that would decide whether Silver Ridge could continue operations while under investigation. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, locals, even former employees. I sat at the defense table, calm and still, as their lead attorney, a tall man in a gray suit, tried to paint us as radicals. "Your Honor," he said, "this entire crusade is the product of one man's personal vendetta. Mr. Carter's obsession has cost countless jobs and threatened legitimate businesses." Helen cut him off. "Obsession?" She walked to the center of the courtroom and raised a file. "This obsession is called evidence. Documents signed by your client's executives. Do you deny this memo exists?" The attorney hesitated. Helen didn't wait. She projected the memo on the courtroom screen, the same one I'd found months ago. Phase 3 expansion, Prairie Ridge land conversion. The audience gasped. The judge leaned forward. Helen's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Your Honor, this wasn't business. It was theft. Systemic, deliberate theft of livelihoods, identities, and homes. They didn't just take land. They took people's history." The judge looked at me. "Mr. Carter," he said quietly, "you've been through more than most men could endure. Tell me, what do you want out of this?" I met his gaze. "Not revenge, Your Honor. Just accountability." Silence. Then the gavel came down. Motion granted. Silver Ridge Holdings operations are suspended pending full investigation. For the first time, I felt the weight lift. Not because they'd lost, but because truth had finally spoken louder than money. When the gavel struck, it echoed through the room like a thunderclap rolling across empty land. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the Silver Ridge attorneys scrambled for their phones, whispering into headsets, faces pale. Helen just exhaled slowly and smiled without looking at me. She didn't need to. We both knew this was only the beginning of their collapse. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed. I'd avoided them for months, but that day I faced them head-on. "Mr. Carter, what will you do now that Silver Ridge is under suspension?" I adjusted my hat and said, "Exactly what they tried to stop me from doing. Build something honest." It wasn't bravado. It was a promise. Over the next weeks, the dominoes fell. Internal emails leaked showing executives ordering falsified environmental reports. Investors fled. Banks froze their credit lines. Silver Ridge's CEO, Preston Vale, issued a public apology that sounded like it had been written by his lawyers. He promised full cooperation, but by then the DOJ had already issued subpoenas. I watched every headline with a calm detachment. The way a man watches storm clouds move across land he no longer fears will wash him away. They had stolen my home, my reputation, my peace, and in trying to destroy me, they had exposed themselves. But justice isn't complete until balance is restored. So while Silver Ridge unraveled, I turned my attention back to the dirt itself, the ranch that had started it all. It looked different when I drove through the gates again. The fences had been replaced, the grass overgrown, barns stripped of their signs. The land felt wounded, as if it remembered what had been done to it. I knelt, dug my hands into the soil, and let it crumble through my fingers. Still fertile, still alive. "Welcome home," I whispered. The court's ruling had voided every fraudulent deed transfer. The 15,000 acres were once again mine, legally, rightfully. But ownership alone wasn't enough. I wanted this land to mean something beyond me, so I created the Ridge Foundation, a cooperative where displaced families and small farmers could lease plots at almost nothing, share equipment, and sell produce under one collective name. We rebuilt the barns, restored the irrigation lines, and turned half the acreage into renewable pasture land. Every hammer strike, every rebuilt fence felt like an act of defiance, a message carved into the earth. You tried to erase us. We grew back stronger. The news caught on. "Former rancher turns corruption battle into rural revival," read one headline. Another called me the man who sold their homes. That last part made me smile, because when the courts ordered Silver Ridge to liquidate assets to repay victims, guess who purchased several of their residential properties through the restitution fund? Me. Dozens of cookie-cutter houses in their luxury developments, bought at pennies on the dollar. And I didn't keep them. I converted them into community centers, shelters, and veterans' housing. Their empire became our refuge. Poetic justice, the kind that doesn't need applause. One evening, Helen and I stood at the edge of the ranch, watching the sun bleed over the hills. She asked, "Do you ever regret how far you took it?" I thought about the sleepless nights, the threats, the isolation. About Daniel, who'd moved to another state under a new name for safety. About the families who'd cried in my office when they got their land back. "No," I said. "I regret that it had to go that far." She nodded. "Justice always costs something." "Yeah," I said. "But so does silence." Months passed. Investigations turned into convictions. Silver Ridge's board members were sentenced, some for fraud, others for environmental crimes. Preston Vale himself faced prison. I didn't attend the sentencing. I stayed home, repairing an old windmill near the creek. As the blades began to turn again, creaking in rhythm with the wind, I felt closure, not as triumph, but as peace. The system that had once been used against me had finally been forced to work for me. Still, every now and then I drive past the old HOA office, the one they built after stealing the ranch. The building stands empty now, its sign sun-bleached, letters half-fallen. I park for a minute, look at the cracked windows, and think of all the meetings they must have held there, deciding my fate, laughing over stolen land. Then I drive on, because revenge ends when you let go. Justice continues when you rebuild. That night, sitting on the porch, I watched the stars return one by one over the ridge. The same ridge where it had all started. The ridge where I'd once promised myself I wouldn't be broken. The air smelled of cedar and dust and rain. I took off my hat, leaned back, and let the quiet fill me. People would tell my story in different ways. Some would call it revenge, others justice. But I knew the truth. It was never about destroying them. It was about proving that a man's worth isn't measured by what's taken from him, but by what he refuses to surrender. And as the wind swept across 15,000 acres of free land, I smiled. Because in the end, I hadn't just reclaimed my ranch, I'd reclaimed myself. After the dust settled, I expected quiet. But peace, I learned, doesn't arrive like rain after a storm. It creeps in, hesitant, cautious, testing whether it's truly safe to stay. At first, the silence on the ranch felt strange. No more lawyers calling. No more reporters at the gate. No more headlights creeping down the dirt road at midnight. Just the wind, the creak of the barn doors, and the distant whinny of horses. I'd been fighting for so long that calm felt like a foreign language. I spent my mornings mending fences, patching roofs, fixing tractors that had sat too long idle. Work that asked for no arguments, no signatures, no strategy, just patience and sweat. Sometimes, while stacking hay bales or checking the irrigation lines, I'd catch myself listening for the phone to ring, expecting another battle. But it didn't come. And that's when I realized something. I had to learn how to live again. One afternoon, I drove into town for supplies. The hardware store owner, an old rancher named Gus, grinned when I walked in. "Well, if it ain't the man who took down Silver Ridge," he said, clapping me on the back. I chuckled. I just did what needed doing. That's what heroes always say. I shook my head. Heroes rebuild. I just survived. But as I loaded lumber into my truck, I noticed a group of young farmers standing by the counter, whispering, glancing at me like I was something more than just a man. It made me uncomfortable, but proud too. Maybe what I'd done wasn't just about reclaiming land. It was about giving people proof that the system could still work if you had the grit to make it. By early spring, the Ridge Foundation had grown beyond my imagination. Families from 3 counties applied for cooperative leases. Volunteers came from cities to learn sustainable ranching. Journalists covered the project as a model for rural justice. But I didn't want the spotlight. I wanted the work to speak for itself. Helen handled most of the public side. She'd become the voice of the movement, sharp and relentless. I preferred staying in the background, hammer in hand, fixing what others had broken. One evening she called me from the state capitol. "They're drafting a new bill," she said, excitement in her voice, "to prevent corporate land aggregation. They want you at the signing." "I'm no politician." "You're the reason it's happening," she insisted. "People need to see what justice looks like when it wears boots and not a suit." I laughed softly. "All right, counselor. I'll think about it." The day of the signing, I wore my best jacket, the same one I'd worn when I lost the ranch, now patched and faded, but still mine. The governor stood at the podium, cameras flashing. Helen was there beside her, reading out the bill's name, the Rural Land Protection and Ownership Act. When they called me up, I felt every eye in the room. "This bill," the governor said, "exists because one man refused to be erased. Mr. Carter, your fight reminded us that justice isn't theoretical, it's personal." I didn't make a speech. I just said, "Let's make sure no one else has to fight the same war." Applause filled the hall. But my mind was already miles away, back on the ranch, where the soil waited to be turned. That night, I drove home under a sky thick with stars. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into the drive. Lights glowed in the windows of the new co-op housing we'd built. Children laughed somewhere near the barn. The place had life again, and I realized something important. Revenge fades, but legacy endures. I'd gone from the man who lost everything to the man who built something that would outlive him. Still, even in the quiet triumph, I couldn't help but think of the ones who hadn't made it, those who'd lost their homes before the courts intervened, the ranchers who'd died waiting for justice. For them, the fight could never truly be over. So I decided to take the Ridge Foundation national. We'd open offices in other states, teach people how to read land contracts, spot fraudulent clauses, defend themselves before losing everything. If Silver Ridge taught me anything, it was that knowledge was the sharpest weapon a working man could wield. The next morning, as the sun rose over the hills, I stood at the edge of the porch with a cup of coffee, watching mist crawl through the valley. Freedom, I thought, isn't something you win once. You have to keep tending it, like a fire. And I wasn't done tending. When the expansion idea took hold, I didn't want to turn it into another bureaucracy. I'd seen enough of those. The Ridge Foundation had to stay what it was born to be. Hands in the dirt, truth in the open. So instead of shiny offices, we built work barns. Each one was a hybrid of classroom, storage shed, and coffee shop where locals could meet, swap tools, share advice. We called them ridge posts. The first opened in Texas, the next in Montana, and a third followed in Nevada. Every time we opened one, I'd drive out for the ribbon cutting and end up staying late into the night talking with folks who'd been pushed off their land. They all told the same story. Big money moves in, promises jobs, builds fences, changes water rights, and within a year the town's name barely means anything anymore. Listening to them, I felt the same heat that had burned in me when Silver Ridge came for my ranch. But now it had shape, a mission. Around that time, a letter arrived from Daniel, the whistleblower. He wrote from Oregon under a different name, said he'd started working for an environmental nonprofit. He'd found a bit of peace, he said, but still carried guilt for helping Silver Ridge before he'd turned. I sent a reply that same night. Daniel, you can't rewrite the past. You can only outlive it. You did that. That's enough. I meant every word, because redemption, like justice, isn't a headline. It's a slow rebuild. Months rolled by. The ranch changed with the seasons. Green pastures fading to gold, cattle grazing where bulldozers once stood. The sound of hammers replaced the echo of courtrooms. Every so often, people would stop by just to shake my hand. A veteran who'd bought land through our program. A young couple who'd started their first farm. A woman whose father's property we'd saved at the last minute. They called me Sir, Mr. Carter, sometimes the man who fought the giants. But I wasn't a giant killer. I was a reminder that you could still fight when the odds said you couldn't. Then came a phone call I didn't expect. A federal investigator who'd worked on the Silver Ridge case wanted to meet. It's nothing bad, she assured me. Just something you should see. We met in a small diner off Highway 41. She was young, but tired in the eyes, the kind of tired you only get from knowing too much. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were new documents, emails from one of Silver Ridge's overseas partners, detailing hidden offshore accounts and undisclosed land deeds. Apparently, a fraction of their money had come from a global network buying rural land under shell companies. I looked at her. You're telling me this wasn't just a national scheme? She nodded. It's international, and you helped us expose the blueprint. I stared at the folder, then at the window where rain traced lines down the glass. It hit me. Silver Ridge was only a symptom. The disease ran deeper. What happens now? I asked. We go bigger, she said. But we'll need help. People who know what it looks like from the ground up. I smiled faintly. Then you've already got your man. That's how I found myself sitting in rooms I'd never imagined. Federal committees, agricultural conferences, even university panels. Everywhere I went, I told the same story. Not polished, not sugar-coated. Just raw truth about what happens when greed puts a price tag on heritage. I didn't dress it up for applause. I didn't soften the anger. Because behind every law that fails, there's a face that paid for it. And every time I finished speaking, people came up to me. Young lawyers, students, farmers, saying they wanted to help, to learn, to build. The Ridge Foundation's membership tripled in a year. I didn't plan it. It just grew, the way wildflowers grow in the cracks left behind by fire. Still, sometimes at night, when the house was quiet and the stars pressed low against the horizon, I'd feel that old ache again, not anger anymore, just memory. The memory of the first eviction notice nailed to my gate. The laughter of the men who thought they'd already won. The loneliness of those first months when everyone told me to let it go. I'd walk outside, breathe in the scent of dust and cedar, and remind myself, I didn't win because I was stronger. I won because I refused to quit. That's the part people never see, the lonely parts between victories. Helen came by one evening, dropping off more paperwork than I cared to read. She was tired too, but proud. You've become a symbol, Jack, she said. I never wanted to be one. Doesn't matter. People need symbols. It reminds them what's possible. I poured her coffee and grinned. You think symbols fix fences? She laughed. No, but they make people pick up the hammer. Before she left, she handed me an envelope. Inside was a property map, 50 acres of open land near the border. Donated, she said, by a family you helped. They want it turned into a learning center, a place to teach everything you've been teaching out here. I looked at the map for a long moment. Then that's what we'll build, I said. As she drove away, I stood by the porch, watching her taillights fade into the night. The cicadas hummed. The sky was a sea of stars. For the first time in years, I didn't feel hunted or haunted. Just steady. Whole construction on the learning center began in early autumn. The mornings were cool enough that breath showed like smoke, and the sound of hammers carried clear across the valley. We didn't hire a contractor. We built it the old-fashioned way. Neighbors, volunteers, and anyone willing to swing a hammer for a free meal and a story. We laid the foundation ourselves. Helen handled the paperwork. I handled the nails. By winter, the frame stood proud against the gray sky. A simple sign out front read the Ridge Institute, Land, Law, Legacy. The day we raised the final beam, a kid who couldn't have been more than 17 asked me, "Mr. Carter, why do you still work like this?" "Haven't you already done enough?" I told him, "Son, the minute you think you've done enough, you start losing what you fought for." He nodded like he understood, even if he didn't yet. He would someday. When spring rolled back around, the first class of students arrived, 20 of them from all over the country. Some were sons of ranchers. Others were city kids studying law or environmental policy. They slept in bunkhouses we'd built from reclaimed wood and woke before sunrise to feed livestock, mend fences, and study land rights in the afternoons. The first lesson I gave them was simple. I wrote 2 words on the whiteboard: stewardship and ownership. "Anyone can own land," I said. "Few can be stewards of it. Ownership is a right. Stewardship is a duty." They listened in silence, and I could see something click behind a few eyes. That's how you change the future, one understanding at a time. One night after class, I walked down to the creek. The moonlight broke across the surface in shards of silver. For the first time since that long war began, I let myself feel gratitude, not the loud, celebratory kind, but the quiet one that lives in your bones. If you told me years ago that losing everything would lead here, I would have called you crazy. But pain has a strange way of planting seeds for something better, if you're stubborn enough to water it. I thought of my father, who'd taught me to respect the land, of Daniel, who'd risked everything to expose the truth, of Helen, whose belief never wavered. Justice, I realized, was never a solo act. It's a chain of people refusing to bow. A few weeks later, I got a letter postmarked from Washington. It was from the investigator who'd shown me those offshore files. "Jack," she wrote, "the task force is expanding globally. We're naming it the Ridge Initiative after your foundation. You probably hate the idea of your name being attached, but the symbol matters." She was right. I did hate it. But I couldn't deny what it meant. The fight had outgrown me. And that was the best outcome I could have asked for. Summer came heavy and bright. The ranch was alive with movement. Kids on horseback learning to herd. Locals running irrigation tests, the clang of tools from the machine shed. One afternoon, Helen arrived unannounced, wearing jeans instead of her usual blazer. She tossed me a folder. "You've been summoned," I laughed. "What now?" "The UN Conference on Sustainable Development. They want you to speak." "United Nations?" I shook my head. "I'm just a rancher. You're the reason rural justice is even on their agenda," she said. "Besides, you clean up well," I went. Not because I liked podiums, but because stories carry further than fences. Standing before a room full of delegates from countries I could barely pronounce, I told them what 15,000 acres had taught me, that justice isn't a system. It's a choice repeated every day by ordinary people. I finished with a line I hadn't planned. "Land doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land. When we forget that, we lose more than soil. We lose ourselves." The room went silent, then erupted in applause. I didn't stay for the photographs. I caught the first flight home. Back on the ranch, thunder rolled in from the west. I stood on the porch as rain began to fall. Steady, cleansing, the way forgiveness sounds when it finally arrives. Helen called later that night. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" she asked. "I built a fence that might actually hold," I said. She laughed softly. "That's one way to put it. Years have passed since the day they tried to steal my land. Silver Ridge is a line in a history book now, its executives' footnotes in legal journals. The Ridge Foundation thrives on 5 continents. The Institute graduates hundreds every year. Sometimes, when I walk the boundary fences at dawn, I can still feel echoes of the old fight, the ache in my hands, the bitterness in my chest. But it doesn't weigh me down anymore. It reminds me. Because justice, like the land, has to be worked, turned, tended, renewed, or it goes barren. Tonight the sky over the ranch is painted in violet and gold. The wind smells of rain and wild sage. I sit on the same porch where this story began, coffee cooling in my hand, watching the horizon blur into twilight, and I think about everything we built from the wreckage. Every home, every field, every lesson carved out of loss. I've learned that revenge gives you a moment. Justice gives you a lifetime. And legacy gives others a place to stand when you're gone. The stars begin to appear, one by one over the ridgeline. I tip my hat and whisper to the dark, "We're still here." Time has a way of sanding down even the sharpest edges of a life. But some stories don't fade, they take root. Years passed, and the Ridge Institute grew beyond anything I'd imagined. What began as one barn school on my land became a network of learning centers across the heartland. The students didn't just learn how to protect land, they learned how to protect themselves, their families, their dignity. Most called me Mr. Carter or Jack. But a few, mostly the young ones, started calling me the Old Ridge. I liked that. It sounded like part of the landscape itself, stubborn and unmovable. I still lived in the same ranch house. Same porch swing, same old windmill that groaned when the wind got high. The world outside changed fast, drones surveying crops, electric trucks hauling feed, but the soul of the land stayed constant. Every morning before sunrise, I'd walk the pastures with my dog, Scout. I'd stop where the hill dropped toward the valley and look out across 15,000 acres of freedom that once hung by a thread. I'd whisper, "Still ours," and the wind would answer back through the grass. Helen visited often. She'd traded courtrooms for classrooms, teaching at the Institute's main campus. Her hair had gone silver, but her voice carried the same steel. One evening she sat beside me on the porch, papers in her lap. "They want to name the new headquarters after you," she said. I groaned. "Jack Carter Hall. Sounds like a post office," she laughed. "It's not about the name. It's about what you represent." I stared out at the fields glowing under sunset. Names fade. Principles don't. Call it the foundation wing. Remind them it's built on more than one man. She smiled, tucked the papers away. "You never did like spotlights. Light belongs on the road ahead," I said. "Not on the man walking it." That night, thunder rolled over the ridge. I lay awake listening to the rain on the tin roof, thinking about all the souls who'd passed through those gates, the desperate, the hopeful, the broken. They came searching for justice and left carrying purpose. That was the true harvest. Sometimes I wondered how long I had left. My hands ached more, my steps slowed, but age never frightened me. I'd already lived 2 lifetimes, one lost, one reclaimed. What mattered now was making sure the fight outlived me. The next morning I gathered the Institute board in the old barn. "Someday I'll be gone," I told them, "and when that happens, you'll face your own Silver Ridge. Maybe it'll have a different name, maybe it'll wear a friendlier smile. But greed never dies, it just changes clothes." I paused, letting the words settle. "When that day comes, remember, the law is only as strong as the people who demand it work." "Keep demanding." No one spoke. They just nodded, eyes bright with the kind of respect that doesn't need applause. After the meeting, a young teacher approached me, Sarah Nguyen, one of our earliest graduates. "Mr. Carter," she said, "when you're gone, what should we tell the students about you?" I smiled. "Tell them I was stubborn enough to believe fairness wasn't extinct." As the years wore on, news outlets sometimes came calling again. Anniversaries, documentaries, interviews. I turned most of them down. But one reporter, a soft-spoken woman from a regional paper, asked something that made me stop. "Do you ever forgive them? The ones who took your land?" I thought a long time before answering. "I forgave the men," I said, "but not the silence that let them do it. That's what I'll never forgive, because silence is what makes thieves powerful." She wrote that down carefully, thanked me, and left. Later that quote ended up on the wall of the Institute. I didn't mind. Some truths are worth carving in stone. One crisp autumn evening, I stood again on the ridge where it all began. The sky burned orange and red, and the wind carried the smell of cedar and rain. Behind me, students laughed near the stables. Ahead, the horizon stretched endless. That's when I realized something simple but profound. My life had come full circle. I'd lost everything on this ridge, and I'd rebuilt the world from the same soil. And if the land could heal, maybe so could I. The winter that followed was long and hard. The kind that painted the fences white and froze the troughs solid before sunrise. My bones felt the cold more than they used to, but I didn't mind. The silence of snow had its own kind of peace. Most of the institute shut down for the holidays. I stayed behind with Scout and a few ranch hands who refused to go home. "Someone's got to keep the old man company," they joked. One morning, I woke to find frost webbed across the windows like silver lace. The fire was low, and Scout lay by the hearth, tail thumping lazily. I poured a cup of coffee, stepped outside, and stared at the horizon where the sun cracked open the frozen sky. The world was quiet. But in that quiet, I heard the echoes of every battle we'd fought, every courtroom argument, every handshake that rebuilt trust, every dawn that followed a night of loss. It wasn't guilt I felt anymore. It was gratitude. That spring, I received a letter sealed in gold foil. It came from the state governor himself. "Mr. Carter, it is with deep respect that we inform you. The state of Wyoming hereby recognizes the Ridge Institute as an official institution of agricultural and legal excellence." I folded the letter slowly, smiled, and said to the empty room, "Took 'em long enough." Later that day, Helen and Sarah arrived with a convoy of students and alumni. They brought cameras, banners, and laughter. The institute had planned a ceremony, a celebration of legacy. But I wasn't a man for speeches anymore. When they asked me to address the crowd, I stood up, looked out at hundreds of faces, and said simply, "You've turned one man's fight into 1,000 hands of justice. Don't waste that." The crowd went silent for a beat, and then the applause rolled like thunder. Not the polite kind, raw, real, human. That night, I sat by the fire again with Helen. The flicker of flame caught her silver hair, and for the first time she looked her age, and proud of it. "Jack," she said softly, "you ever think of retiring for real?" I chuckled. "From what?" "Breathing." She smiled. "From fighting." I shook my head. "Can't. Fight's the only thing that kept me alive long enough to see peace." She reached across, touched my hand. "You've already won. The rest is just legacy." Her words hung in the air like embers. Legacy. I'd heard it before, but that night it felt like a verdict. The years that followed blurred together in quiet dignity. The ranch thrived, the institute expanded, and I spent more time teaching than talking. We trained veterans, farmers, even young lawyers from the city who wanted to learn what justice looked like outside marble walls. Sometimes, I'd walk past the main hall, the foundation wing, and see my own quote etched on the entrance. "Silence is what makes thieves powerful." It stopped me every time. Not out of pride, but because I remembered the version of me who had once stayed silent, believing fairness would defend itself. It never does. One summer afternoon, a boy about 10 years old ran up to me near the stables. His name was Eli, a ranch hand's son, wide-eyed and full of mischief. "Mr. Carter," he said breathlessly, "is it true you sold the HOA's houses?" I laughed. "Who told you that?" "Everyone! They say you beat the bad guys by buying their homes and selling them right back to the people they bullied." I crouched, looked him in the eye. "That's close enough to the truth, kid. But remember, revenge doesn't fix what's broken. Justice does. That's the difference." He frowned, thinking hard. "But isn't justice slow?" "Yeah," I said. "But so is growing something worth keeping." That evening I wrote a letter, one I never meant to send. It was addressed to the man I used to be, "Jack, you did what you had to. You lost faith, found fire, and built something no one could take again. Don't regret the storm. It taught you how to stand. And when the day comes that your boots stop leaving prints in this dirt, remember the land remembers you anyway." I folded the letter, sealed it, and tucked it into the drawer of my desk. By the time the next winter came, I knew my days were thinning. I could feel it in my chest, each breath like a borrowed coin. Helen found me one morning, sitting on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the mist roll over the fields. "You okay?" she asked gently. "Never been better," I said. "I finally learned how to sit still." She smiled sadly. "The land looks good." "Yeah," I whispered. "It's in good hands now." That night, as the last light faded over the ridge, I took one final walk through the pasture. The wind carried the scent of pine and memory. Scout followed close behind, his paws soft on the earth. I stopped by the old oak tree where everything had started. the place where I'd first seen the trespassers, the line where my land had been stolen. I put my hand on the bark, rough and familiar, and said quietly, "We took it back." Then I turned toward the house, the lights glowing warm through the windows, and for the first time in decades, I didn't feel like I was fighting anymore. That night, I dreamt of rain. Not the kind that floods roads or tears through fences, just a soft, steady rain that soaks the earth in quiet forgiveness. I stood in that dream with my boots sunk in mud, watching the horizon shimmer, and I swear I could hear the land breathing. When I woke, dawn had just touched the hills. The light was pale gold and the world smelled clean. Scout was curled up beside my chair, snoring softly. I reached for my journal, the same leather-bound one I'd kept since the first day the HOA came for my land. Its pages were wrinkled and coffee-stained, the ink faded in places. I flipped through the years, each entry a battle, a revelation, a scar, and then I wrote one last line: "The land remembers its keepers." I closed the book, slid it into the drawer beside the letter to my younger self, and felt a strange peace settle over me around noon. Helen arrived again, this time with Sarah and a group of students. They were planting saplings near the ridge, oaks, maples, a few cedars. I watched from the porch as they dug, laughed, and worked shoulder to shoulder. When Helen noticed me watching, she waved. "Come join us." I smiled and shook my head. "I've done my planting." She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded with a knowing smile. "Then rest, Jack. We've got it from here." It was the first time I ever believed her. That evening, a soft wind rolled through the valley. The house creaked with age but stood proud, the same way I did. I poured myself one last cup of coffee and walked out to the porch. The horizon burned red, the sun sinking behind the distant hills. For a moment, everything went silent. The crickets, the birds, even the wind paused, as if the land itself was holding its breath. I thought of all the people who'd stood beside me in this fight. Helen, Sarah, the workers, the students, the farmers who refused to bow. They were the reason it all mattered. I whispered into the wind, "You're free now." And the wind, faithful as ever, carried it away. When Helen came by the next morning, she found me on the porch, the empty cup still in my hand. Scout sat quietly beside me, his head resting on my knee. I was gone, peaceful, still, with the faintest smile frozen on my face. No grand farewell, no drama, just a man who'd finally made peace with the world he'd fought so hard to save. The news spread fast. People from across the state came to the ridge for the memorial. Students, ranchers, lawyers, even the governor himself. They stood in a circle beneath the oak tree, the same one I'd touched on my last walk. Helen spoke softly. "Jack Carter didn't build an empire. He built an idea. That justice isn't granted, it's grown. And like any good harvest, it outlives the farmer." Sarah added, her voice trembling. "He didn't just reclaim land. He reclaimed dignity for all of us." Then Eli, the ranch hand's boy, now grown into a young man, stepped forward with something in his hands. My old hat, the same one I'd worn through every season, battered and sweat-stained. He placed it on the oak stump. "He said the land remembers," Eli murmured. "So we'll remember too." The crowd bowed their heads. The wind swept through the ridge again, rustling the new saplings. Somewhere in that sound, it felt like I was laughing, low, warm, content. Years later, people would still come to the ridge. The Institute kept growing, its reach stretching across states. On the front wall of the main hall, beneath the carved quote, hung a simple plaque. Jack Carter, 1949-2025. Farmer, fighter, founder. He sold injustice and bought back the soul of the land. Every new class of students would walk past it on their first day. And every teacher, every worker, every farmer who found hope again in those fields would add another silent chapter to the same legacy. Because Jack Carter's story didn't end on that porch. It lived on in every voice that refused silence. In every acre that stayed free. In every person who learned that justice isn't something you wait for. It's something you build with your own hands. And as long as the wind still rolled across the ridge, carrying the scent of cedar and dust, it would whisper the same truth to anyone who stopped to listen. The land remembers its keepers.